706 crew campaign. As Jeff mentioned, we moved about 1,000 cubic meters of waste associated with that campaign. For those of you who can't really visualize a cubic meter, it's about 5 drum equivalents, 55-gallon drum equivalents in a cubic meter. So basically, in the last 14 months, we've moved about 5,000 drum equivalents out of Los Alamos. The second bar coming down is where we're going to actually remove the newly generated waste in FY 12 and 13 by the end of December of 14. So even though that's a very small activity and it's kind of stuck there at the end of the 3706, as Jeff mentioned, we are shipping that waste as we go with the 3706 campaign. And for example, this first quarter, we have a very large amount of newly generated waste. The next two activities, and there's a little diamond in between that's kind of a milestone, and that's associated with the use of Area G. So one of the things that we have to do is set a time when we're going to be out of Area G in order to get the rest of the waste out of Area G. So when you look at that logic, that diamond represents the time when the new transuranic waste facility would be operational. So when the newly generated waste comes out of the processing facilities, rather than going to Area G, it'll go to the new facility. So we plug that in. It's toward the end of fiscal year 16 as a placeholder for when that facility's up online and we stop taking that newly generated waste into Area G. And that the line below that one is associated with characterizing and shipping the waste outside of Area G. So in the middle of the page, the line that is right above the two different colors is associated with the waste that's found 3706 waste and non-newly generated waste. So when we came up with the 3706 campaign, it was very much a risk-based campaign. So we're really looking to get the waste that was either combustible waste or dispersible waste out of the areas first. When you look at that inventory in Area G, there were about 850 cubic meters of cemented form waste or metal waste that are either dispersible or combustible. So we set those aside outside of the 3706, and I don't want anybody to think that we're forgetting about that waste. So we put the activity bar in that shows us processing that waste basically from the middle of this year on through the end of FY16. So at that point in time, if we didn't do anything else, the above ground inventory would be gone. And today that's about associated with, in addition to the new gen and the legacy waste, the 3706, non-3706, that's about 50,000 curies. So rather than waiting until we're done with all that, to go ahead and address the underground waste and to keep our operating facilities operating and fed, we want to go ahead and start working the below grade waste. Those seven categories that I talked about earlier. So looking at the lower part of the chart, the first one, of course, are trenches A through D. So when we asked the three questions, we determined that, yeah, the trenches A through D did have to be removed. They are transuranic waste. They are in a retrievable state. They're in small shafts, 2 drums per shaft. They're sitting right on top of each other in a 30 shaft. So we'll go in and remove those 720 drums and process those 93,000 PE curies and ship those to WEB. So that'll start in the middle of FY14, and we'll go out through the end of 18. Now, once again, as we look at this thing, there was a lot of thought that went into the end state. How do we ship this material as we generate it? So one of the things we try to do is mix the waste. So we really like to have waste that is high volume without a lot of plutonium equivalent curies mixed with a low volume with a lot of plutonium equivalent curies. That way we can meet our shipping criteria and we get the best bang for the buck with regard to the real estate equipped. And I think Denise, I don't know if I'll see her, but I'd like to give her some kudos. She's entertained us throughout this year. Thank you for several workshops we've had with the Carlsbad folks that we've actually used the CAB offices for. Where we actually worked through the details of how we ship the material that we talked about. And actually, we went through this, we drew this chart on the board a couple of times before we actually finalized it. But right below the trenches A through E is the pit 9, the high volume. So we want to work those two in parallel so that we can get good, efficient shipments going to web. So once again, pit 9 will start at the middle of FY14 and will go through 18. And we'll work those two in parallel to get good, efficient shipments to web. Once we get those to a steady state, we're also going to go in and start retrieving those corrugated metal pipes that came out of TH11. Now, the reason we want to do those is that's weight. So that's going to, once again, present an opportunity to mix some of the heavy weight, those cemented forms, and with this lightweight material coming out of the trenches A through D and pit 9. So we're going to start that up about a year later in 15, and once again, it will run to the end of the campaign, the end of 18. And right below that is pretty much everything else except the 33 shafts. So at the end of FY16, we'll have a little bit of a transition going away from material coming into Area G. So we'll have an opportunity to spend a lot of time working on that 17th canister and the tritiated material and those hot set liners that are in those 5 shafts. So from 17 to 18, we'll pull those materials out, go ahead and process those and send those to web or to disposal. Disposal whether it's appropriate for whatever kind of waste terms it can be. So I don't think there's much question about those 6 elements. We'll get into those middle of the next fiscal year, and we'll run those to completion and be completed by FY18. One thing I would like to highlight about this plan is that in any plan you develop, you have to make some assumptions. And we assume the $239 million funding, annual funding from the government to execute this plan and stay compliant with both the individual permit and the state of New Mexico. So that is a very significant assumption that we've made in developing this plan. So let's talk about the 33 shafts. Once again, we're talking about 3.4 cubic meters and about 97 plutonium equivalent curies. There are 33 of the shafts are fairly shallow shafts, and I think a lot of the waste that's in the shafts were based on research that was done over the years, and a lot of the material in there has some cobalt material in with that transuranic material. So when you look at the makeup of these shafts and the material in the shafts, that differs from everything else is they do have the dose. So when you look at all the work we're doing very low dose work. So we can train their workers through our neighbors and friends, and we've increased that staff quite a bit over the last 6 months. They're the guys in there with hands in the waste, and they're protected clothing, of course, but they're the guys that repackage the waste. And this is a very manual activity that we do. And when Jeff talks about the box lines and things like that, these are people, 6 or 8 people on a ship that are actually in there repackaging the waste, getting those prepared items out of it, putting it in compliant containers and getting it ready to ship away. One of the things that we looked at with regard to do we get more benefit than not when we do this is the workers associated with doing this waste. So in doing our due diligence on that, one of the things that we're going to propose in this plan going forward is that we look at the option of leaving them in place. So I know that's a pretty bold statement, but there's a lot of things that have to happen before we can actually go forward with that. One is we have to go through the NEPA process. So we're actually putting together the NEPA documentation, which from a public perspective, you guys will have an opportunity to look at that documentation and give comments on that. We're also looking at other things such as some of the federal regulations, in fact, specifically 40 CFR 191 for leaving any transuranic waste anywhere. So there's a lot of work that has to be done in evaluating that option of leaving it in place. So we've put activity bars on the schedule that show those activities going on through about FY15. Now, when you look at all the rest of the waste that we're going to be retrieving, the big years are really the second half of 14, 15, 16, and 17. So if this turns out that we are going to actually remove the 30-foot shafts, we wouldn't have done those until later anyway. We want to get those large volumes, those large PE curies as the first priority on there. So basically we're going to go through that process, and that can go either way. So if it turns out that we're going to leave those in place through the NEPA process and through the other evaluations that we're going to do, the activities beyond that diamond that's the end of 15 will probably change a little bit. If it turns out that we actually exhume that material, we'll start down the path of working that project to remove the 30-foot shafts. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that. One of the things that we found when we were looking at this is there's not availability of a facility in Los Alamos to actually handle this type of waste with the high dose rates that we have there. So the big portion of this project isn't just going out and pulling up those shafts or pulling out the waste in the shafts. It's actually building a facility and getting it operational, training the workforce, and actually getting to the point where we can do that. So the retrieval process itself, when you look at the overall scale of this, is fairly small. The big heavy lift is actually getting the facility and processing the waste so it can be compliantly packaged for women. So in this plan, we'll start that in FY15, going through our process for capital projects. And that will end up, the project will end up sometime in 19, so this will be a hazard category 2 nuclear facility. And then we'll actually start processing the shafts. So just wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about that project.
Mr. Cox?
Yes.
Was that the decision for that option, was that based on risk? Was that based on cost? What was your methodology on?
It was based on worker risk.
Worker risk?
Once again, the big difference in any other waste is the dose rates that we'll be dealing with. And we don't have a workforce in the environmental program right now that is qualified and capable of doing high dose work. Now, secondary, we did look at the capital projects and the cost of the capital project, which is significant, and the duration of the capital project. So, first, it was risk to the worker. Secondly, we looked at the cost of the project and finally, the duration of the project. The other thing, in parallel with that, we really looked at the risk of leaving it in place. So, once again, we wanted to go down the NEPA process and go through that to see if that what the effect that leaving it in place would have on REG and on the So that, in essence, is the plan. There's, I think, about 5 or 6 pages associated with the plan that we're going to deliver to NNMCAB. This schedule is actually an attachment to the plan, so it's going with the plan. There's also a little chart that just puts in writing what I said about the different waste categories, how many PE curies, the volumes, those sorts of things. I would like to highlight one thing on this chart that's a little bit toward the right end of the chart, associated with those 6 other screens. When you look at 2 primary things, one is volume and one is plutonium equivalent curies. If we do not take out the shafts, we'll remove about 99.9% of volume and about 99.9% of activity. So, from a standpoint of how much are we taking out, we're taking out a very significant amount of transuranic waste off the hill and out of Los Alamos. So, I think in essence, that's the plan.